Listen-only mode.
Hello, and thank you very much for taking 45 minutes out of your day to join this webinar on the future of carbon financing for low carbon development. We're absolutely thrilled to have well over 50 participants from across Europe and North America and a few beyond attending this afternoon. Really appreciate your interest. So, I'm Jonathan Shopley, Managing Director at Natural Capital Partners, and I'm joined by Alyssa Gilbert from the Grantham Institute and Mary Grady from Winrock's American Carbon Registry. Now, both are going to talk about their work in those institutions, but by way of background, prior to joining Imperial College in 2015, Alyssa worked with the energy and climate consultancy Ecofis, covering a range of topics actually. And Alyssa, I met you when you did your masterful reports on behalf or for the World Bank on the state and trends and futures of the carbon markets. So very well qualified for us today, to join us today and to give something of an overview of that. Now, Mary has over 20 years of experience in environmental markets. Her career began at the American Wind Energy Association, which served as a consultant also to the World Bank, as it happens, on creation, financing and oversight of rural energy programs. Went on to manage 1,500 megawatts of wind project portfolio in the US, as well as projects in Latin America. Mary joined Winrock in 2008 with roles that have included Managing Director of Winrock's Brazil operations, and is now Deputy Director in Winrock's American Carbon Registry, which you'll tell us more about, but is one of the initiatives of Winrock. So together we're going to be covering the following topics. I'm going to set the scene. I'm going to then turn to Alyssa, who will speak about the evolution and role of carbon financing for low carbon development and the future role of voluntary offsetting. And then Mary's going to follow with some practical examples of how carbon offsetting will work in our new post-Paris climate agreement world. And I'm going to close with a summary of what this all means for business over the next 5 to 10 years. We're going to have time for questions, and if you'd like to ask a question, can you do so throughout the presentation via the question tab on the control panel on your screen. You just type in the question, don't forget to press send, and we'll collect these through the presentation and tackle them in the Q&A. So this one's called Ringing the Changes, and it's really quite auspicious that we're holding this webinar today, because yesterday the number of countries and the aggregate emissions of those countries that signed up to the Paris Agreement or supported the Paris Agreement in December last year have all ratified this agreement, which means that within 30 days implementation of the Paris Agreement will begin. It's going to take over the heavy lifting from the now somewhat tired Kyoto Protocol. Now, as the slide says, the Kyoto Protocol operates until 2020, so we're in the pre-launch phase. The Kyoto Protocol was supposed to run out at the end of 2012, but then got extended by 8 years to give us the chance to get the Paris Agreement into place. It was very much a top-down mechanism. The UNFCCC Framework Convention on Climate Change required developed countries to take on a target, and left developing countries without a target, a binding target, which meant that there was really no way for us to get on track on the trajectory for a low carbon trajectory and a stable climate, because within the developing economies were countries like China and Brazil and South Africa with rapidly rising emissions. The other thing about the Kyoto Protocol is that written into it was the opportunity to use market-based mechanisms, particularly the clean development mechanism is the one that's sort of dominated, and that really allowed countries, and in the voluntary side, companies and other organizations and individuals to finance projects in those countries without a target, so that they could offset their emissions under their targets. So mitigation projects for compliance and voluntary action were very much possible and were a very strong feature of the Kyoto Protocol. Now, under the Paris Agreement, which will become active from 2021, it's bottom-up. The difficulty of getting developed and developing countries together, that was a feature of the Kyoto Protocol, has been solved by the fact that all nations have non-binding nationally determined contributions that have been signed into the Paris Agreement. And when I say non-binding, it means that these are voluntary. So we are all in a voluntary situation right now. But what is mandatory under the Paris Agreement is that all these countries will need to report their progress against those targets, and the aggregated effect of those reduction activities will determine whether we get on that trajectory or not. Now, in this instance, in the Paris Agreement, we've got Article 6, which was a very difficult article to negotiate, but it provides for emission mitigation mechanisms like the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, but it's now called emission mitigation mechanisms. And their design has been left really to the work that will begin at the next meeting of the UNFCCC in Marrakesh, which is coming up in a couple of weeks' time. But because all countries now have voluntarily subjected themselves to targets, we have a new issue to deal with in this post-Paris world, which will be additionality and double counting. And by that, what I mean is we need to make sure that any party funding a reduction and claiming credit for that doesn't double count that, or in fact makes a reduction happen that wouldn't have happened in the absence of that financing, and also that we don't double count those reductions. And so mentioned in the Paris Agreement is the internationally transferable mitigation outcomes, the ITMOs, which is really, I think, the best way to describe it for any accountants on the call. It's a sort of double entry bookkeeping to make sure that reductions don't get double counted. So before I hand over to Alyssa, I just want to frame the two presentations that are going to come now against the sort of the evident truths in favor of offsetting, or what we've called here the future, the carbon financing for low carbon development. Much of the discussion in the lead up to Paris and since the successful Paris summit has been about carbon pricing, the idea that we need to put a price on carbon in order to send signals to all economic entities operating globally around the world that the free emission of greenhouse gases will come to an end, and therefore they need to think, we all need to think about our investments in low carbon or no carbon technologies and processes. So there's high hopes for that, but carbon pricing means a lot of things to a lot of different people. If you look at Canada as an example, they've very recently, in the last 2 days, the Premier of Canada has announced that Canada will take on carbon pricing and will leave it to the provinces to decide whether they will use a carbon tax or a cap and trade mechanism in order to apply the price of carbon. Now, offsetting, which is the mechanism that will that evolved initially under the CDM of the Kyoto Protocol and will hopefully take on a new form under the emissions mitigation mechanism, is a price, places a price on carbon, because carbon financing determines the price of a reduction associated with a project. So not only does it signal a price, it actually causes money to move from the organizations supporting the reductions to the projects that deliver those. And that's a very powerful argument in favor of enhancing and maintaining those mechanisms. The second argument that I wanted to to mention is that within the Paris Agreement is an expectation that corporations around the world, countries around the world, will set in train policies that will cause us to, enable us, encourage us to transform from a carbon-intensive economy, global economy, to one that's low carbon or no carbon. But the reality is that those policies get transformed into reality through projects, whether they're projects within businesses, within the infrastructure of nations, but it is generally projects that result in actual reductions. And projects need finance, and the offsetting mechanism as practiced under the Kyoto Protocol and what we and into the future is a mechanism that delivers finance specifically to projects. And efficient markets, which I know Alyssa will talk about, direct finance, are very good at directing finance to the most valuable, in other words, most cost-effective projects, reduction projects. And then the final argument in favor of carbon financing and offsetting is that Article 6 calls for specific attention to sustainable development beyond just mitigation of greenhouse gases. And around the same time as the Paris Agreement, or actually a little earlier, the UN announced the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which give great substance now and meaning to 17 areas of action around sustainable development. And one of the things that the following presentations will highlight is the fact that offset projects deliver co-benefits that are very much in line with the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Objectives. So with that by way of context, I'd like to hand over to Alyssa to pick up particularly on the market-based approaches to carbon.
Thanks, Jonathan, for that introduction and thorough description, particularly of the changed world that we're in, especially since the ratification, which is very exciting news, hot off the press, indeed. And I wanted to pick up on some of the points that you made about the real role, the continued role that I think offsetting will play in this sort of world and moving us towards a low carbon world. So there were a few particular points that I wanted to pick up on from what Jonathan talked about. The first one was that although we see ourselves in a more bottom-up world in the context of the Paris Agreement than we were in before, this doesn't mean that there isn't a role for offsetting. So you could argue, for example, that because every country now has a goal, why do we need offsets, and what is the role for the voluntary market? But I think we see quite firmly in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement the real potential to build, again, like we had with CDM, but something different and new, the Sustainable Development Mechanism. And this mechanism will allow a project-based approach to reducing emissions. And I suspect that this will become incredibly valuable. With 197 countries party to this agreement, there'll be many new countries that didn't have obligations before that will need to experiment with ways in which they're going to achieve their mitigation reductions. And this kind of mechanism that's been at least set up or made available in Article 6 will become very important. As Jonathan said, the detail of what Article 6 will look like in practice will start to be negotiated in Marrakesh in November, but I think some of the particular language that it's important to pick out in Article 6 itself is the mention of private entities, which I think really opens up the voluntary market if we've seen it applied now, and also some of the purchasers or project developers that we've seen work well in the Kyoto context. And hopefully we'll see more of that as well. And then of course the language itself about delivering sustainable development is very key. The voluntary markets in the past have been very successful at combining outcomes that aren't just about mitigation but are about co-benefits for the communities, and that's something that I think the voluntary market will continue to deliver. So I think that's very, very important. Then, as well as the entire Paris Agreement, it's very important to remember that there are a couple of key sources of emissions that are outside the Paris Agreement. You can see from my slide that obviously I'm going to talk about aviation. People often use the rough number of 2%, that aviation is 2% of global emissions, but we certainly can expect that percentage to grow for two reasons. Aviation emissions are growing themselves as demand rises all around the world. And in addition to that, what we would hope is that as the Paris Agreement begins to be implemented, emissions will reduce in the sectors where it's easiest to do so, and as a result, aviation will become proportionately a bigger percentage of emissions. What that means is that that sector will need to start trying to reduce their emissions, and we know that as things stand right now, there aren't very many technical options available for the aviation sector to reduce their emissions, and the technical options that there are actually really quite expensive. We know that right now, actually, the aviation sector, under the auspices of the International Civil Aviation Organization, are actually negotiating after many years an agreement between themselves to voluntarily reduce their emissions. And actually the mechanism that they've chosen is an offset approach. So we can see actually that even with that demand alone, the voluntary and offset world should be alive and kicking for sure. So there are other sources of demand quite outside of the Paris Agreement. Then I think it's useful to mention or dwell upon a little bit the value that markets deliver. Now that's markets in all their forms, so that includes emissions trading systems, taxes, but of course the voluntary markets are an important part of that also set prices at a project level. If we imagine the Paris world where all of the countries will have to make emissions reductions, having a market-based approach there will deliver efficiency because it will enable the emissions reductions that can be found at lowest costs to be discovered, some kind of price discovery, and it will make the global cost much lower of delivering the Paris Agreement. Some of my colleagues, AJ Gambier in particular at the Grantham Institute at Imperial College, has done some modeling that's shortly to be published in the 2016 version of the State and Trends of Carbon Pricing report. And in his analysis, he tested what this kind of flexibility delivers, so the flexibility of carbon markets. And it's quite an extraordinary reduction in cost. So with a global carbon market of some sort in place, it reduces the cost of delivering the current NDCs by a third by 2030. And if you look towards the middle of this century, it reduces the costs to 50% of what they'd be otherwise. And that's an enormous reduction of the cost that we'd expect to deliver a 2-degree world. But I think even more importantly, his modeling shows that it would almost be impossible to deliver a 2-degree world without some kind of market-related flexibility that allows for price discovery and allows for emissions reductions in different parts of the world. And so the voluntary market and offset type projects, I think, will remain really, really important in enabling this broader market framework. It's also interesting to note that the modeling showed that the financial flows to developing countries of this kind of market approach would be as high as 2 to 5% of the GDP of some of those countries, and that's certain to deliver on some of the sustainable development goals that you would like to see come in tandem with mitigation efforts around the world. So markets are also valuable in terms of efficiency, and that's another argument for having offsets in place. Then it's also valuable to see what else markets deliver. I think those of you who've been involved in voluntary offsets and crediting will know that it's not just about emissions reductions. There's a lot of other intangible benefits you deliver. Many of those are social and about sustainable development, but some of those are also about innovation. In the slide that I'll show you now, you can see these two enormous flowers. What they represent is the benefit that innovation brings, particularly in the clean tech space. What you can see, and these sort of flowers were developed by kind of studying the impact of the emissions trading systems, but that is very similar to what you get from offsets. And what you see, each of those nodes within the flower is an innovation that was made into a patent, and it's connected by lines to follow-up innovations and follow-up patents that were created. On the right-hand side, you see the impact of a whole load of clean innovations, and on the left-hand side you see dirty or fossil fuel related innovations. And you can see that not only is there an enormous knock-on effect from the innovations that you get from putting an emphasis on carbon markets and low carbon development, but you also see that if you make clean innovation, you actually get a much bigger impact, and that brings innovation benefits directly to the economy, and then all of the knock-on effects that you get from that. So stimulating markets can also deliver these innovation benefits. If you turn to the next slide, I would also argue that we need to decarbonize the world fast from now on, right? We have a ratified agreement and now we need to decarbonize fast. If I explain to you a little bit what's going on in this slide is the result of some more research at the Grantham Institute, where we're looking at what we need to do to achieve a 2-degree world. The orange section tells you how much decarbonisation costs. The green section tells us about the speed that we need to decarbonise to reach 2 degrees. And the blue one talks specifically about the deployment of key technologies. The top line, so the top strip that goes orange, green, blue, describes what would happen if we start taking action to decarbonise our world from 2020. And the bottom line explains how much more rapidly and costly that would be if we only started at 2030. But if you focus on the top line, which is taking global action by 2020, which is already quite soon, that we want to start, you'll see that actually the rate of decarbonisation has to be 2 to 9% a year. That, if we consider that our fastest known rate of decarbonisation is 4%, you'll appreciate that that is a very rapid rate of change. We need to use all kinds of scales of action to make that happen, and all kinds of mechanisms and approaches. And so whilst we can imagine that there may be large national programs of system, things like energy efficiency and so on, I would certainly argue that a voluntary approach that targets certain areas and certain technologies will still be extremely valuable. So if we just pay attention to the pace of change, it seems evident to me that we need the voluntary markets and we need these project-based efforts to continue. And if you look to the right-hand side in the blue, you'll see some specific information about what that deployment would mean in specific technologies. It shows you gigawatt per year installation required of some of the known technologies that we have there, like wind and solar. And those numbers in terms of gigawatts a year are pretty high and pretty significant. And for some of those where a project-based approach might be relevant, for example, decentralized solar, you can imagine that the voluntary market will be a very important part of the story of delivering those technologies. It's also important, people talk a lot about R&D and delivering technological silver bullets, so to speak, but this slide here perhaps shows kind of a cautionary tale. It illustrates that you can't deliver change as quickly as you might hope. So technology, R&D development and deployment takes quite a long time. This entire chart from the left to the right shows a timeline from 1950 through to 2010, and it particularly shows the policies driving solar PV innovation and cost reduction. And what you can see is that the recent reductions that we've seen in the prices of PV solar it's really the end of a story that started in 1950 with investments in Bell Labs R&D, following on in other investments in R&D such as space research, and coming straight through to the last 10 years or so, where we've seen a lot of feed-in tariffs, tax credits and so on, support for deployment. And that's actually been very important in taking the technology to scale, both delivering scale through those programs, but also then leading to a knock-on cost reduction that enables even greater scale. And because of what I've just shown you in the previous slide about the rate of change that we need to reach 2 degrees, I would argue that the offset type programs that also helps delivery on the ground and testing technologies is part of the story of enabling low cost and rapid deployment of the kinds of technologies that are available already, but we really need to deliver a low carbon world. And finally, on my last slide, I'd just like to illustrate a couple of the key challenges in front of us. And there are 2 key challenges where I think offsetting and voluntary markets can really help. One of the challenges is financing. That's something you mentioned already, Jonathan. That's a role that the voluntary markets can really play, and the offset markets, which is delivering finance. In sort of traditional finance has been coming across some problems with how you cost in the risk, or the perceived risk of investments, particularly in developing countries, when you're trying to invest in low carbon activities in general. And we published a briefing paper on that in January this year. Some of those perhaps can be overcome by either testing or actually providing financial flows through voluntary mechanisms. So I think the offsets will be one way of many, hopefully, to try different models of overcoming the finance challenge of delivering the low carbon world that we're looking for, and perhaps also delivering some adaptation actually as well. And then the second challenge that I foresee are technical challenges. So it's often said that both the CDM but the voluntary markets as well have focused on specific regions of the world and delivered specific technologies or specific reduction approaches. That kind of focus could be brought to bear on some of the technical challenges we have ahead. And I've used as an illustration here bioenergy with CCS, and the little pictures from 1 to 3 are meant to show you there that it should be quite a straightforward process. Theoretically, you grow some trees and then you you burn them to produce electricity, and you capture and store the carbon emissions. And what you do there is then you're actually have a net reduction in emissions. If you look at the 2-degree scenarios that most people are assuming we're going to follow, one of these decarbonization pathways, they pretty much all assume pretty high levels of negative carbon emissions at some point. If we're going to do that, then we really have to have technologies that work. Most of them are untested. And if any one of these negative emissions technologies could be taken up by the voluntary offset community or even tested by them, that would provide an enormous leap forward in terms of what's possible in terms of delivering our 2-degree world. So with that, I'll finish. And I hope that was a sort of persuasive argument as to why I think that the voluntary markets and offsets are here to stay and are an important part of delivering the Paris Agreement.
Alyssa, thanks so much for more than a scene set there. Mary, without further ado, I'm going to pass to you to talk what's happening in the US, in ACR's world, that shows how things might evolve into the future. Over to you.
Very much, Jonathan. And Alyssa, I really appreciate your scene setting for the work that we do on a daily basis at American Carbon Registry. We are, for those who are not familiar with us, we are a carbon offset program. We operate globally, but our primary activity has been in North America and in the United States. We're part of a larger nonprofit organization called Winrock International, which is was originally founded by philanthropist Winthrop Rockefeller with a mission of empowering the disadvantaged, increasing economic opportunity, and sustaining natural resources. So American Carbon Registry was actually founded in 1996 by some pioneering folks at Environmental Defense Fund, and then was rolled into Winrock International in 2007. And Winrock really saw American Carbon Registry as a way to help it achieve its global mission. And the idea that markets are the most effective path to mobilize actions to reduce emissions and also achieve other environmental benefits is central to Winrock's belief, and American Carbon Registry is really helping to achieve those objectives. We've been operating for the past 4 years as an approved California Offset Project registry, and we help support the California Air Resources Board implement the California Offset program as part of the Cap and Trade program. And we're also deeply engaged in the voluntary carbon market to help create innovation and stimulate carbon finance, as Alyssa was mentioning. So you can go to the next one. So as Jonathan mentioned, we were very excited about the Paris Agreement and Article 6. Obviously, the global commitment under the Paris Agreement is critical. In particular, of the top 2 greenhouse gas emitters, the US and China, that account for almost 40% of emissions combined. So not only having US and China commit to the Paris Agreement, but be among the first to submit the Articles of Ratification was really, really exciting. The Paris Agreement itself is exciting because it does create a global ambition, but the thing that's really important to note is that the Paris Agreement is not going to be able to achieve the global warming target on its own. So it's really counting on sister agreements in the private sector to contribute to meeting these goals. And Alyssa mentioned the International Civil Aviation Organization, a new amendment that's being negotiated under the Montreal Protocol is important, and the Paris Agreement specifically cites the role of governments in the private sector to help achieve the goals as well. The Moroccan Environment Ambassador noted that we have to reduce the potential the gap in potential shortfalls, and we have to get moving immediately because the Paris Agreement doesn't enter into force until after 2020. So we have another 5 years where we really need action. I wanted to say a couple things about the role of offsets in this time frame. So under the International Civil Aviation Organization, they actually are setting their own targets for carbon neutral growth after 2020. They are including an offset mechanism. That is expected to be approved this week at their meeting in Montreal. And they are setting up criteria for offsets and offset programs. And what's interesting is it seems as though they're moving also, they want to be in line with what's going on under the UNFCCC, but they also are in some ways moving more quickly to set the rules for a global offsetting program, which would include approving multiple offsetting mechanisms from around the world that meet robust criteria. So in addition to the Paris Agreement itself having Article 6 and the mechanisms for emissions reductions and ITMOs, as Jonathan explained, the International Civil Aviation Organization is also going to be relying heavily on offsets to help aviation achieve its emissions reduction objectives. The other really big place where we need action is in the refrigerants world. So under the Montreal Protocol, various ozone-depleting substances were phased out of production, but their use is still allowed. And these are primarily high GWP, global warming potential refrigerants that are removed from appliances, they're recycled and reused, and they leak into the atmosphere. So the phase out of those ozone-depleting substances actually spurred the production of hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs. So they were developed as ozone-friendly alternatives, but pound for pound, they have global warming potentials up to 4,000 times higher than carbon dioxide, and they're the fastest growing source of emissions in the US and globally. So there is no currently agreed phase-out schedule for HFCs, and so urgent action is really necessary. And it's commonly believed that curtailing the production and use of HFCs is really completely essential to meeting a limit of our global warming, and that HFCs can contribute 0.5 degree to 1 degree Celsius to that target. So it really is important. Even if that happens, and that's being negotiated right now, even if that happens, it won't take effect for anything from 5 to 15 years. So there is a window of opportunity for early action and for a market mechanism like offsets to help spur those early reductions in that transition to low GWP refrigerants. Lastly, on the private sector's role, the private sector really has an important role to play in voluntary offsetting. A lot of companies that report to the CDP, I think almost half at this point, either already have or plan to have in the next 2 years an internal price on carbon. And what that does, it essentially creates an emissions cap for that company. And that really lends itself to offsetting because the internal price the company set the average is about $18 a ton, which is significantly higher, probably even double of the highest prices that are paid in the voluntary carbon market for credits. So across the board in the Paris Agreement, civil aviation, Montreal Protocol, and the private sector, you can see that all of this is needed to help us get to that target, and offsetting is going to be a critical part of that. In our world, in the United States, offsetting is not only alive, but it's growing. We didn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol, and we unfortunately did not enact a national cap-and-trade program, but nevertheless, we have been charting our own course, and in many ways, we've been operating in a post-Paris world all along. Our world has been a bottom-up world where we have several jurisdictions with carbon pricing. So that includes California, which is part of the Western Climate Initiative, currently linked with Quebec, soon to link with Ontario and other jurisdictions. The 9 states that are part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, Registry, and then Washington State recently announced its Clean Air Rule. So all of these compliance markets are built on voluntary market experience. They all include offsets, and the constructs that we expect that will be named and further defined under the Paris Agreement are all the same approaches that are used in these markets: the standard monitoring, reporting, and verification, baseline setting, issuance on a registry, and tracking. So in the California market, the method really was to adopt protocols based on voluntary methodologies, and then to work with voluntary programs to help them oversee the implementation of their program. In the Washington State model, they've actually approved 14 different offset project types from the voluntary market. and 9 of which are ACR offset project types, and those would be able to generate credits for compliance. So California has really been demonstrating an impact, delivering almost 50 million compliance offsets to date. Of note is that 30 million of those are from forestry and 12 million from ODS destruction, so really innovating in those spaces to help achieve targets. And then again, in the U.S., the voluntary market, the U.S. supplied the largest number of credits for the voluntary market and is also the largest buyer to date. In our program, we really have prioritized the development of methodologies that have, for sectors that have large potential, and we want to be able to accelerate change. So I have a couple of examples from agriculture, ODS, and transportation, where we have been working on the ground with folks to test these new concepts, innovate technologies, reward the early action of taking these risks through the carbon markets, and then promote technology transfer outside of the United States. Next. So we've been working with some pretty untraditional sectors for the past years, and I think we would consider them kind of non-traditional participants in the carbon markets. We've been working with farmers, ranchers, small forest landowners, supermarkets, refrigerant recyclers, trucking companies. And these are a couple of examples of projects that are underway in areas where there is no regulation in place and an opportunity to contribute significantly to emission reductions, but also all of these offset project types have very, very interesting and important sustainability co-benefits with water savings and management and habitat preservation, economic development, in the case of wetland restoration, really helping to soft infrastructure to protect hard infrastructure, so creating stability for levees and protecting against storm surge and flooding in hurricane-prone regions. So I think it's been very exciting to see the carbon finance channeled towards these types of projects. At the same time, we really need to get scale on those. Forestry, as I mentioned, it's an area that has a huge potential in the United States. We've been working in particular with Native American tribes and corporations and timber operators, and also with family-owned forest lands in aggregating reforestation projects. There's been a lot of activity in the California and voluntary market, and we hope that that we can help grow this area as well, because it's another area that has great greenhouse gas potential, but also co-benefits. Next. I mentioned the work under the Montreal Protocol and the really critical role to help stimulate early action. We have 3 different methodologies in this area to help stimulate the destruction of ODS materials, to reclaim HFC refrigerants instead of buying virgin materials, to use low greenhouse gas warming potential, GWP, refrigerants in refrigeration systems, and then also to transition to low GWP blowing agents in foam. And the reason this is all important is because all corporations and all supply chains have these refrigerants in them. It's part of commercial, residential buildings, data centers, hotels, supermarkets, refrigerators, refrigerated transportation systems, building appliance insulation. So it's really, really important if you're looking at your corporate emissions or even your supply chain emissions. This is a great way to help stimulate these reductions is these types of offsets. Next. And last, I would just mention this trucking fleet efficiency. We've been working with a couple of groups, the Truckers Carbon Exchange and Idle Air, on projects that increase transportation efficiency and have other benefits with reduction of particulate matter, safer truck drivers on the road, and obviously the avoided emission of millions and millions of gallons of diesel fuel use. So they're super innovative projects. The overall reduction potential in the United States is enormous. It's just that the upfront costs of these technologies are high, and the trucking companies are operating under low margins. So this is another area where carbon finance could really help stimulate the investments. Lastly, I think in summary, it's kind of the same things that Jonathan and Alyssa were both mentioning, that we really need carbon offsetting to help achieve emissions. It's not all going to come under the Paris Agreement and under national commitments. We need the private sector as well, and that we just need to channel more investment to these innovative new technologies and sectors. Thanks very much.
Mary, thank you. That was a brilliant tour de force of great work that ACR has been doing and the developments that have gone on in the US. I just want to close out reflecting on the fact that with the coming into effect of the Paris Agreement, there is now a real signal that we're moving from intent to action, and just reflect a little bit on what's happening within the corporate world. If just at this, using this very simple diagram to summarize that, the Paris Agreement talks of a 2-degree Celsius rise. Scientific evidence is taking us to a 1.5 for a stable climate. That, as you've heard from both Mary and Alyssa's, suggesting that we need climate leadership, not just by governments, but by corporations. It's an urgent issue. And then as we look at corporations taking climate leadership, we see 3 components to that that's really driving change. The first is that the way in which the leading greenhouse gas protocol allows corporations to add up their emissions or calculate their emissions has recognized the incredibly valuable and critical role played by renewable energy. And there's a getting to 100% renewable energy that is now at the heart of many corporations' strategies as they move their position on climate change from a CSR position into a strategic de-risking of and future-proofing of their businesses in a rapidly changing world post-Paris. The getting to zero it's focused really on greenhouse gas emissions directly from an organization, and getting to zero is tough. Getting to 80%, which is the scientific imperative, is still very tough. And of course that's a combination of 2 things. It's internal reductions, investments in projects within organizations that reduce emissions, and then using external sources of reductions, which is the offsetting and the carbon finance that we've spoken about. Now the interesting thing for me is that offsetting is the one thing that already gives a price of carbon that I mentioned earlier is so prevalent in discussions around our most important lever, pricing carbon. So organizations often wonder how much internal reduction they need to do before they go to external reductions. The market for carbon offsets provides some indication of what that might be. Anything you can do for less than an external reduction is something that will save you money, increase efficiency, and reduce carbon emissions. And the final theme or plank to this component is sustainable development, which is so critical really to the next decades ahead as we enter into the sort of 5th industrial revolution. And as both Alyssa and Mary pointed out, so many of the projects associated with carbon reduction or carbon finance deliver sustainable development benefits, positive impacts as an integral part on that. And there are many standards, carbon standards, ACR, gold standard, who are particularly now paying attention to valuing those in addition to the reductions. So in summary then, I think that each corporation as climate becomes much more strategic has real levers to pull on today around 100% renewable energy, getting to zero, and supporting the Sustainable Development Goals through well thought out and well designed climate leadership programs. And I'm just going to leap a little bit ahead to one of the questions that's come in, because I know we're up against our time, which is, how can we make sure that private sector projects, especially voluntary ones, will be recognized under the sovereign level accounting for the Paris Agreement. one of the things that I would say in summary too, including the summary, is a call to action to governments to recognize the complementary, powerful role that needs to be played by voluntary action, and to look for ways to legitimize that by putting in place suitable regulations, quality and integrity checks to solve for the additionality and the double counting issue or conundrum that we mentioned, which can be done. Japan has done that already. They have a voluntary market where corporations effectively donate, as it were, their emission reductions to the governments in inventory. There are other ways of doing that, doing the double bookkeeping approach. And then to promote, to incentivize corporates with credit for early action, or as is being developed in South Africa, an opportunity to use voluntary offsetting to reduce exposure to carbon taxes, which will play out in some of the provinces in Canada, for example. So that's just by way of answer to one of the questions, and I'd like to just turn over, just to see whether there are a couple that we can squeeze in to the time that we have left. Alyssa, there is a very specific question to you about the 4% fastest known sustained annual rate of decarbonisation. You know, how can you give an indication of how that was quantified, or at least reference us to something that somebody could read? Because I'm sure that's going to be a tough question to answer immediately.
Yeah, so the research that was done looked at over decade periods what was the fastest rate of decline, the fastest average annual rate of decline over given 10-year periods, and the 4% was the fastest average annual rate of decline over a given 10-year period, which was the fastest, which was between 1973 and 1983. But as Jonathan rightly points out, you'll find out a lot more if you go to the website, which is for Avoid2, which is the project that it was for, and you'll be able to find the infographic that I've shown you on the slide deck there, and you can click through to get plenty more information about how all the different parts of that infographic were calculated. So if you type in Avoid2 to your browser, you'll find all of that information there.
Thanks very much. And you know, on our final slide that's up on the screen now, you do have contact email addresses for Mary and for Alyssa, should you wish to be in touch on further topics. I'm just going to take one more question, and we do have a number, so apologies to those who haven't had their question answered, but do remember that you can be in touch with us. Mary, given the work that's gone on in the US around ACR's work in developing carbon reduction standards, you know, to monitor and verify and register those reductions, the question here is really if we're going to transfer our attention to nations and to sustainable development, how important do you think it is to maintain the carbon methodologies when we're shifting our focus perhaps to adaptation and other sustainability aspects?
Well, certainly the adaptation and other sustainability benefits are going to be important, but the frameworks that have been created under the CDM and in the voluntary markets and in other compliance markets around the world really do have, you know, the methodologies, the monitoring, reporting, and verification that have been developed and enhanced, provide a discipline and a robustness and a use of best practices that really help ensure the integrity of the claims that are being made. So I think really the carbon markets have now defined what is considered best practice, and it is it's important for in particular, we feel in the voluntary market to hold a very high bar to that, so that everybody's following kind of the same rules. And what we can do is help create, link the carbon accounting and metrics and verification with looking at ways to quantify or otherwise link to the adaptation and sustainability benefits, and that's something that we are working on right now.
Mary, thank you very much indeed, and I'm so sorry that that's all we really have time for, and thank you for those who stayed a few minutes longer than our allotted 45 minutes just to take a few of those really pressing and important questions. We thank you very much for attending and for your questions. As is normal for us, a recording of the webinar is going to be available on our website next week. We thoroughly welcome your feedback. Be happy to answer any questions, so please be in touch using the emails on the slide if you would like to. We're going to close the webinar now, and just finally again thank you first to you, the audience, and to our presenters, Alyssa and Mary. Goodbye for now.